sing some of those together. But sometimes there is something about being outside with joyous voices and being able to sing out loud some of those simple songs. Um, Before I forget, we have someone once again willing to take the children, yes, with Libby. So if any of our children would like to go, once again, she'll take you to another part of the park. If you don't, I told her she can stick around for the best sermon ever. So whatever you prefer to do, but Libby's willing to take you if you'd like to go with her. She's back here. Then I'll let you lead them, take them to the breezeway again. Headed to the breezeway, okay? First of all, last week, if you were not able to be here last week, or we just found out some had a hard time hearing last week, as he'd be my second cousin, Richard Willoughby, was here. He was in town for my grandma's memorial service, and I shared with you, he's one of those guys that any time he comes to town, he at least catches me one time, and the one question he'll always ask me is, what are you preaching on right now? And part of me hates it when he asks that question, because honestly, there's sometimes I don't know what I'm preaching on yet when he asks it. Part of me loves it because it also keeps me sharp, knowing he's coming. He's very similar to a friend of my grandparents that lives out in Oregon, that every time he sees you, his question will be, what's the verse of the day? So if you see him coming from a long ways away, you always pull out your phone and look up a verse real quick so that you're ready to go. But he'll always say, so it's a similar type deal where on one hand it's like, oh no, here it comes. But on the other hand, it keeps you sharp. But every time I get together with Richard, he asks me that question, but it ends up leading into a really good, deep conversation. To me, one of my favorite things to do is sit with folks that are, now I would say one of my favorite things. It always hasn't been. But one of my favorite things to do now is sit with folks that are older and wiser and have been there and that get it, and just sit and listen to them, especially when they're passionate about something. And Richard is one of those guys, and I remember I've said before, but again I said, you know, sometime when you're here, you need to come and you just need to share this with our congregation. And the day after I said this to him this time, he called me the next day and he said, are you serious about me sharing with your congregation? Are you really open to that? I said, sure, whenever you're back in town, let's work this out. And he says, I'll be here Sunday. Is that okay? And that's what led to him being here last Sunday. And I absolutely believe it was, for many, many reasons, a God-appointed time and a purpose for him being here. And so if you weren't able to hear him last week, or you weren't able to hear him while you were here, or you weren't able to hear him because you weren't here, I encourage you, he's a lot shorter than me, so you'll like that. But he's on YouTube, and go back and listen to what he has to share. Because even all through the week, I've heard different people bringing up, I really appreciated what he said here, or I really liked what he had to say there. My own brother was sharing with us at lunch the notes that he took based on just some of the gems that he dropped throughout it, because he is just one of those guys where you just want to sit down with a cup of coffee and say, you talk. Well, I write this down real quick. You talk, and he just gives you something. The other cool part is he was asked to write some articles for our paper, so he's going to be doing that, which he's written over 4,000 articles. He's written a couple books. He's working on his third one. But we are very blessed to have him with us last week, and we're blessed to have him still on YouTube. But I encourage you to go back and listen to him, because it also fit in with what we have been talking about the last couple weeks, about being the hope of the world as the church. Realizing that our call is to be the hope of the world. If the church is not doing it, I mean, just stop and think about this for a minute, but if the church really is not being the hope or being the salt and light that Jesus came to be, that he transferred on to us, then who is? And if we want to continue to talk about the world being dark and going to pot and all the stuff happening, but not do something about it, and our calling is the church, what do we expect? So we've been reminded the last couple weeks before that is our calling. We are called to be the hope of the world, the light. We're called to be salt. But it begins with who we are being more than it is about what we're doing. And we looked at those two things, and then I was going to finish with what I want to share today, but then this thing happened with Richard, and again, I'm glad that it did, because he just added on to anything that had already been shared. And he also gave me another week to share what I want to share with you. And I told you last week, I asked that you guys all come back. This time it's not a weed eater. Apparently that bird doesn't like what we're saying either. Or God's just saying, yeah, he's right, listen to him, okay? That's the best amen we've gotten in a long time. I'm just actually kind of afraid after our talk, John, though, that he's going to poop on somebody right now. We were just talking about birds pooping on us. So if he comes near, would somebody please give me a heads up, okay? I do have an undershirt on, so if I got to take it off, which also, if we go too long and gets hot, I can just take this shirt off and we can keep going. But it gave me another week to share what I want to share with you, because on one hand, I really feel like I need to share this today, but on the other hand, I'm scared to death to share it today. And the reason I'm scared to death to share it today was spoken really well by another pastor that I was with yesterday. Leanne and I went to a wedding in Dighton of a guy that works for her, and Brant Rice did the wedding. And so afterwards, I got to talk to him a little bit, and we were talking about the stuff he's been preaching on going through this time. And he said he gave one message a few weeks ago, and he says probably I don't know if he said the hardest, but one message that, man, it really got taken the wrong way. Because I've never gotten so much feedback with people being upset about things I didn't actually say in it. And it's because of the topic. When a difficult, polarizing topic comes up in a difficult, polarizing time, we tend to hear what we want to hear. And what happened was they didn't hear everything he was saying. And they were hearing phrases, and they were hearing words, and they were tying it to other things they were hearing, and they were expecting that was the way he was going. And so he said that turned out to be one of those very difficult ones, and that's how I feel about this. But I feel like I need to share it anyway. All I ask for you is to listen to all of it, and to consider all of it as a whole. And the reason I'm sharing it is because we continue to go through transitions in a weird time. On one hand, I want to get away from everything going on, but you also can't run away from what's actually taking place. But we continue to go through transitions in society, as a culture, and even as the church. And as we do, as I shared a minute ago, for those that are on boards and committees and making decisions, it's not easy because there's a lot of fears that people have in this time. I have them. I'll admit I have fears. I have things that I'm a little bit afraid of happening and taking place during this time. I'll bet if I asked you, you'd say, I have some too. But I'll share with you some of mine. I have a little fear. And I'm going to be honest, this is where I am. I have a little fear that I could actually get this virus that's going around and give it to somebody that it could be more lethal for. I do have some of that. There are times where I think, okay, I need to be careful here. I need to be smart here, because I don't want to be the one that does that. I'm not going to lie. There's a little bit of that there. I do think about it a little bit. Even yesterday at the wedding, we thought about it and said we got to be smart while we're here. So I try to be a little careful. However, if I'm also being honest, that's the least of my fears that I have right now. I fear even more that in the midst of this, including myself, that as we go through that we're going to become so nervous and so careful and so cautious that we're not going to keep living and enjoying the life that God has for us and the breath we have every day. And I don't just share that just out of me being scared. It's because you see it and you hear it. That we go over the top from being careful and lack of reckless to I have a fear that we're going to become so isolated, and I'm trying to think of the word when you clean something, whatever. Huh? Not OCD, but that could fit too. OCD about it, I guess. You know, when you clean something up all the time, that we're going to be afraid to do anything. And I experienced this even the other day coming out of Subway after I was done meeting with Gracie, as I watched a little boy, probably 3, 4, maybe 5 years old. I'm really terrible at telling ages. But a little boy with his face mask on and her mom with her face mask in his face outside the door, chewing his rear because he touched a door. We can't do that. We can't touch the doors. Actually, I'm hoping she was actually saying floor, but I couldn't understand it for sure. But it was either floor or door, but it was not just a, hey, don't do that. It was a, if I can say it, a butt chewing taking place to this little boy. And I thought, I get it there, but a boy's a boy. And it struck that chord of that fear that I have. I fear that as new scary things come out in the future now, that our first reaction is always going to be pull way back and be scared of everything that comes. I fear that. And again, we slowly but surely stop living or set things up in such a way that our kids don't. I fear, and I've shared this before, that the current, what we call new normal, is actually going to be pushed as the new normal and create problems that we don't see. Just found out the other day with some family here, there's a lot of places in Portland, these sit-down restaurants that are now considering not having sit-down ever again. There's one thing about business, but there's another thing. Didn't Jesus break bread with people a lot? There is something that happens over a meal, but I fear that these things that we're pushing, we've heard it before, the handshake is no longer going to be around. We're no longer to hug. I fear that. I really do. That's going to be pushed because there's deeper implications than just a moment in time where we may not be able to do that. I fear some things that I'm not going to say out loud. But I do fear that the emotional, psychological, and even physical implications could be more disastrous than the actual virus itself. And here's the thing that feeds that fear to me even now, as we're seeing it. I came across this article from a magazine, HuffPost, that, trust me, is not on the side of anybody who thinks this is all a joke. They are ones that will push what's going on. But I want to read to you, this is an expert, supposedly, a professor of health behavior at Gillings School of Global Public Health at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. So if you got a title that long, you must be smart, or you spent a lot of money going to school, one or the other, when it's that long. But he says, there is no question that people are profoundly affected by the major events that occur in their lifetime. People who lived through the Great Depression have different tendencies than those who did not. Those who grew up during the Vietnam War have a different outlook than those born post-war. It is to be expected that modern-day society will be shaped by the COVID-19 pandemic. And then this professor goes on and he says, the psychological after effects of disasters typically emerge 6 months after the event ends. He anticipates long-term mental health effects and societal changes as a result of the pandemic, which has kept millions of Americans isolated socially and physically for months. And he says because it's ubiquitous, so see, he's smart, he just used a word I don't even know, but because it's whatever that is, because it's everywhere, because it hits us 24/7, we tend to lose track of the effects of COVID on our daily lives, mood, and consciousness. Well, what will the similar effect of having lived through the greatest global pandemic in over 100 years be? He says there are going to be many, many long-term effects, and he worries about depression, suicide rates, and marital problems, things that are currently at heightened rates because of the pandemic. And then just today, the director of the CDC just came out and said suicide and overdose has now exceeded the COVID deaths through this. I fear that, guys. I really do. I have fears. From the other side, as we seek information and direction or rebuttal to what we're being told to do, I fear that our source of guidance and our trust is going to become too dependent on others who are as imperfect as we are. And we're going to continue to look at human leaders to lead us through it instead of the God who knows exactly what is going on and what we need to do about it. I fear we're going to continue to look at all this information that comes at us and put all our trust in them. To those that are opposed to everything being advised and pushed right now. There are those that just, this is all dumb, I'm not going to do it. I have a fear on that end too. I fear that we're going to become so strong-willed and bullheaded that there's going to be no heeding of advice or listening to caution, to the point that we're going to become reckless and dangerous. And you see it, and you hear it. And I fear that those who are opposed, we're going to start considering as weak and as having lack of faith and as acting like sheep, which we've heard. Which ironically, if we're really being honest, all of us are sheep. Jesus even said we are, no matter what side we're on. But we're going to start doing that, and then that leads to some of my biggest fears of it all that I want to hit on today. And that is that people are going to become so worn out, so disheartened, so frustrated, so irritated, and so angry with everything that they're just going to seclude themselves away from others and pull more within themselves. And eventually, when it's all said and done, I fear that the judgment, the shaming, the guilt, and the fear are going to break apart relationships that are so important that God created us to have with each other. That is my ultimate fear in all of it. And I've been struggling with this for a couple weeks because those are just some of my fears. So imagine what happens when everybody else's fears get mixed in with it. We're seeing it. Craziness happens. In fact, we just had family here, and one of my cousins is a police officer in downtown Portland. We all know what's going on in downtown Portland. He made a comment just before he left, and we were talking about, hey, we're praying for you as you go back into that, because he's had to go back to work, and we were talking about it. And then the comment he made, you know, it really is just the perfect storm of everything that's led to crazy. All the stuff I shared is all taking place, and we are seeing it played out in things that make us go, I don't even get it. That's because everybody's allowing the fears that may be the same or different, it's all mixing together, and boom, here's what we've got going on. So that's why I feel like we need to talk about this, because again, we as the church are somehow supposed to bring hope into this. We're not supposed to be adding to the fears. We're not supposed to be adding to the craziness. We're not supposed to be getting there and being some that are helping keep this going. We're called to bring some kind of light and some kind of salt and some kind of hope within all of this. And I believe that even includes the Waukene Church of God in Little Waukene, Kansas, out here where people don't even realize we exist yet in many places. I want to strongly encourage us and even challenge us to remember who we ultimately are and who we ultimately belong to, so that we can then ultimately live out our calling as the hope and the light of the world. Defensively, I still want us as a church to be the one that the gates of hell cannot even overcome. Offensively, I want us to be the church that actually provides salt and light to people, places, and proceedings that are all around us. That is what I want our goal to be in the midst of all this that I just shared. And I believe that it's possible. I believe that we can. I don't think we're just called to it. I think we're empowered to be able to do it. This is not the first time the church has had to prove that it is who God says it is, and that it has the ability to be hope and salt and light. There have been things all through the course of history that have tried to divide and break down and tear down the church and overcome the gates. I encourage you, go back and look stuff up. It's crazy, some of the things that the church has faced over the years. Simple different views and opinions on theology and doctrine have led to try and completely break it down. It's done a good job. That's why we have over 30,000 different denominations now. But over the years, different views on just simple theology, simple things from Scripture and doctrine from it, has tried to break it down. Who and how people should lead in the church from the very beginning has always been there trying to break it down. Remember a guy named Paul and Apollos? And they said, you say I follow him, and you say I follow him, and I say, who are either one of us? There's always been this issue that's tried to break down the church. How a person should dress. We kind of laugh a little bit at it now. I mean, we may be irritated by it, but it's been a big deal over the years. There was a time where it was a big argument. Do the women wear dresses or do the women wear slacks? Do the women wear jewelry? The Church of God itself had a period of history called the black tie controversy. It was wrong to wear a black tie in church because it produced this look of I'm better than you or something. I don't remember what the whole thing was, but they actually call it the black tie controversy. And it would split churches and people within it and try and bring it down. Worship styles have, over the years, tried to break the church down. What we should or shouldn't be eating or drinking have tried to break the church down. It's amazing. Right away we think, oh, well, I mean, obviously you're talking about alcohol. No, it was wrong to drink coffee or tea in the church for many, many years. And it split people. Social issues like race, sexuality, the importance of and the role of women. It wasn't that long ago that men and women sat on different sides in a sanctuary. Political differences. The argument as to whether the church needs to be more conservative or the church needs to be more liberal continues today, all the time, on political issues and those societal issues. I still love to hang on to what my mentor, when I was first being ordained and everything brought in, said to me. He says, Jesus was a conservative liberal, was his answer. It's like, what do you mean by that? And he goes, he's conservative in his values and he's liberal in his love. That's what we need to follow. It's like, oh, I kind of like that. But even in that, people will go, nah. And issues like that have tried to break the church down for years, and it still is. Did you know yesterday in Portland, churches got together and did prayer walks. They decided we're going to start taking back this city. So they did prayer walks. They had a worship service. They had a concert in the park worship service. And you know what happened during this? Some other churches got together because they didn't agree with that, and they came and protested the churches worshiping against the protest. I'm not kidding. Things have always been trying to break down when it comes to political and social issues. And then, of course, our buildings have been attacked and Bibles have been burned and people have literally been killed or burned or, like the Apostle John, boiled. And it's been in gruesome ways. When the Apostle Paul was headed, the Emperor Nero was the one in charge, and he was the one that was killing Christians in such a way that he would actually dress them in shirts made with stiff wax fixed to axle trees, and he would set them on fire in his garden so that he could illuminate them, make an example of them. All these things have happened to the church over the years, and it's endured. All these things that have tried to bring it down, and it's endured. That's why I believe that even in this time, the church can still endure and be the hope of the world. In fact, I go so far to say is after all that stuff that has happened and all that stuff that's taken place and all the stuff that's endured, to me, it would be a shame if this is the thing that finally brings the church apart and breaks us down, is a piece of cloth. I don't want that for us. We're not called to that. This shouldn't be our mark in history to say this finally did it in. Instead, we are in a moment where we get to deal with the attack that is trying to divide and conquer, and we have the opportunity to stand and to fight back and to win today and make a different mark in history when the church stood up again. But the weapon we use is not what we think. In order to do it, I believe there's only one weapon that we can use to make it happen. And it's the weapon that God has been pushing us to use from the very beginning. Real quick, open to Matthew chapter 22, if you would. It's a weapon that is so simple, but we have to pull ourselves back and look at over and over and over. But in Matthew chapter 22, and I forgot my Bible today, which is pretty bad. I'm going to look it up on here. Never mind. I'm not going to, because I don't have internet. Anyway, in Matthew chapter 22, there was a moment, and we just cannot just let this go. It's become so common that we just almost overlook it. But there was a moment when people were trying to bring Jesus down. They were trying to stop the church before it ever started. They didn't like what he was doing. And they would come to him and they would challenge him and they would test him and they would try and catch him in a loophole and they would try and make him look bad. And a teacher of the law came to Jesus and he said, Jesus, what is the greatest commandment? In other words, what is it really all about? If we don't do anything else, what do we need to make sure that we do? What is it that you most want us to follow? And there were so many commandments that they had created at that time. They thought for sure they were going to get him on this one. They said, what is the main one? And Jesus' answer was this: to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. Those guys at that time would have went, you're right, Jesus, that's correct. We knew that because that's already been in there in the Old Testament. And so they got it. They realized he'd shared the right thing, but Jesus didn't stop there. We tend to stop there sometimes, but he said, that's the first and greatest commandment. And then he said the second is like it. In other words, there's another thing I want to tell you as you do that is right, coincides with it. In fact, it's how you do it. And it is this: to love your neighbor as you do yourself. Just stop for a moment and think about that. Imagine, it's hard to do, but imagine I'm Jesus right now. And I would tell you, guys, the thing I most want you to do is love God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength. And then imagine if he said, that is the first, that's the greatest, that's the most important commandment, but I have one more thing I want to tell you that's just as important. It's like it. Love your neighbor, not just love your neighbor. Love your neighbor as you do yourself. That is the weapon that we win this battle with. That is the weapon that the church has won with throughout history, is the weapon of loving God as we love other people the way that we love ourselves. Imagine what would happen if we would apply that to each and every situation we're in. Or at another time he says it this way, he says, do to others as you would want them to do to you. It is so simple, but imagine what would happen. Unfortunately, we're struggling with this, and I can't think of a better time in my history to try and put it into practice, but unfortunately, we're struggling with it. Instead, it seems to be, instead of love thy neighbor, has turned into gossip about thy neighbor. Post on Facebook, Instagram, or whatever about thy neighbor. Judge thy neighbor. Compete with thy neighbor. Try to be more right than them. Curse thy neighbor. Ignore thy neighbor. Abuse thy neighbor. A lot of hate thy neighbor, and even, you hate to say it and admit it, but even kill thy neighbor. A friend of mine had on Facebook not too long ago that they were really up. There was a whole thing about this whole thing with Sturgis going on, and actually writes on his Facebook post, South Dakota is about to infect the country. Sturgis is still happening. Masks are not required. The highway to hell is real and supported by a Republican governor. That was his comment, but what got me wasn't the comment that he wrote. It was the response from a fellow believer whose response was this: well, it's time for a few of the selfish dirtbags to die. I read that wrong. Well, it's a time for a few to die, the selfish dirtbags. With a emoji of a guy smiling with sunglasses on. It's not love thy neighbor, guys. We've filled that in with a lot of other stuff. But we're called to love. And as I finish it out, I just say, how can we do that? Here's 4 simple things I think we need to consider. First of all, is what the idea and picture of God's love actually is. We need to reacquaint ourselves with the picture and idea of God's love. I encourage you to go back and read the whole thing in 1 Corinthians 13, but we heard it just again yesterday. But remember, our definition of love is quite different a lot of times than what God's is. The pastor actually did bring it up yesterday. We often, when we talk about love, it's I love chocolate. I love my car. I love basketball. I love whatever it is you might have on there, being able to lounge around on a Sunday afternoon. I love when the pastor's done talking about love, whatever it may be. I love, that's kind of how we do it. But if you stop and think about it, do you realize what we're calling love there is everything we love because of how it serves us and how it makes us feel? That's why we love it. Because we do know that chocolate's not good for us, right? Well, I guess maybe a little bit. The dark chocolate, the nasty chocolate's good. The other stuff that's good is not good for us. But we love it because of how it serves us and makes us feel. The definition that Scripture gives us through Paul isn't like that. And we need to reacquaint ourselves with that because his definition, he says love is actually patient. And love is kind. You know what? There is no way how anything that you can convince me that the comment that was put on Facebook is called love. No matter what else you want to do, because that is just not kind. Because that's the definition of love. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. Here's a big one right now. It is not proud. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. And it doesn't delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. The love that God talks about always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. This love never fails. We need to reacquaint ourselves with that. In fact, I would encourage you this week, every day, to go back and read that and say, today, put your name in there. Parent can get up in the morning and he can open his Bible and he's going to say today, parent is patient. Parent is kind. Parent is not going to envy. Parent is not, or whatever name you want to put in there. Alan can do the same thing too. Don can put it in there. We need to put that in there because that's God's definition of love. And we need to reacquaint ourselves because it's hard when the stuff's coming at us to actually live that out and refamiliarize ourselves with it. I might get mocked for saying that, and you might go, really, that's your answer? Yeah, it is. In fact, I know I will because there's a YouTube video going around mocking pastors for talking about pushing love. So I know it'll be there, but that is the weapon. That definition is the weapon that we fight with, that the church has fought with over the years. And you know why I think it works? Because it gives you a voice. In the midst of all the yelling going on right now, nobody's listening. They're just getting more upset. But when somebody will stop and be patient with them and be kind and actually say, let me hear what you have to say, all of a sudden we might have a voice to be able to share what it is that we're not in agreement with or what it is we're struggling with that they're doing or what it is that's going on. It's a more powerful weapon than we realize. So we need to reacquaint ourselves with it. And in the process, while we're doing that, maybe we need to identify what it is that's making us want to abandon the commandment to love our neighbor. What is the